Okay, sorry about that. Back to theory on page 47 in Ambrosino. So what I was saying is that they do a pretty good job of defining theory, but theory is formulated based on conducting research and collecting data. Whether that is quantitative, meaning mostly numbers, or whether it's qualitative, meaning evaluating the content of someone's conversation, or looking at people's lives from an anthropological perspective or something like that. So their discussion on the two roommates, they point out about how the one roommate's able to articulate a theory. Well, that's kind of true, but it's a very informal way of talking about theory. So theory is a much more formal process than what they're describing, and it's really based on well done research. And a theory is kind of like a worldview or perspective. It's kind of like, how do you see the world? So we're talking about the generalist perspective, and we were talking about politics a minute ago. So if someone is a libertarian or a Democrat or a Republican, when you mention welfare to a libertarian, they're going to have a different view or perspective on welfare than they will as compared to a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or whatever other party. Now, unfortunately, most people who belong to a particular party aren't that good at analyzing issues using data. They tend to be more emotional about it, but a theory is kind of like that. It's kind of like, if you are a libertarian, you're going to have a particular perspective on an issue or a subject. And that's what a theory is. You look at an issue, your client's situation, for example. If you're sitting there thinking about it from the perspective of a generalist practice, or if you're thinking about it from the perspective of what Ambrosino talks about later, the Freudian theory, then you're going to be thinking about those and your client's information in two very different ways. So that's a little bit about a theory. And again, they point out on page 47 on the second column near the bottom, the same set of facts can be ordered in different ways depending on who is doing the ordering and the worldview of the person or group. And so that relates to what I just said about libertarians and Democrats and Republicans. They can look at Medicaid or Medicare or whatever, or Social Security, and they will look at those facts differently because they're coming from a different perspective. On page 48, the authors make an important point that a good theory must be testable, that you must be able to measure it, behaviors, pretty much, things that you can see. The major reason we have a somewhat limited theory in understanding and predicting social welfare problems and human behaviors is because it's difficult to measure what people are actually truly thinking and their emotions and that sort of thing. So that's a much more difficult process than it is to measure behaviors. But we'll be talking about that a little bit more in research. And then they also mention on page 48 in the second column that it's important to consider different theoretical perspectives because looking at only one limits our understanding of the world, of clients, and of interventions. And then under the section that says the system's ecological framework, they say in the first paragraph, consider the definitions, plural, of social work. So again, there is more than one definition of social work. People have different perspectives. They analyze the information in a different way. So that's not a bad thing. It can actually enhance or broaden our thinking about what social work is. but sometimes beginning students have difficulty with that. Why isn't there one definition? Doesn't that mean that means we don't know what we're talking about, or something like that? On page 49, they mention that in the first full paragraph, they mention we choose to use the term systems ecological framework rather than theory because a perspective is much broader and more loosely constructed than a theory. So I think that's interesting. They don't really talk much about what that means, that it's more broader and loosely constructed. So I wish that they had, but so they're suggesting that the generalist system, the systems ecological framework, has not had as much data perhaps to say that it's a theory, or it doesn't meet all the definitions of a theory. I'm not sure. They don't quite explain that very well, but that's an interesting point to note. And then on page 50, they look at, under the perspective of systems theory, that it was first used to explain the functioning of the human body. And it reminds me that in sociology, there is a theory or perspective called the functionalist approach, which sounds and is very much alike the systems theory, where they look at how systems are interconnected and relate, and the analogy is that the body has organs and systems, and if one doesn't work well, then it affects all the others. So it's similar to that. On page 52, the diagram they have there, figure 3.1, you'll probably want to refer to that when we look at week 5 for genograms and ecomaps. Also on page 53, they talk about, under interactions and interrelations, they talk about boundaries and open and closed systems are structural aspects of systems, and sometimes systems perspective is called the structuralist perspective. So to throw in another term that you may read at some point, that systems and structuralist can be considered similar or the same thing. And then on the second column of page 53, they talk about cause and effect relationships between two factors. And one thing that I want to say here is that they make a note that something that's changing in one part of the system affects another part of the system as well, as I mentioned earlier. But I also want to point out that the difficulty, the extreme difficulty in proving that one factor causes another factor. So sometimes you'll see headlines in the newspapers or on the internet or whatever that something like, taking aspirin will lower heart attack rates. And while this could be true, it's extremely difficult to say, therefore, that aspirin is the sole cause of rates in lowering the rates of heart attacks. So, if somebody came out and said, oh, we have a lot fewer heart attacks these days, and it's entirely due to aspirin, that is an extremely difficult thing to prove. In fact, it's almost non-existent. I can't think of one example at the moment, but it's almost non-existent that you can always say that X causes Y, because there are almost always a whole bunch of other factors or variables that can be included or part of what's going on.